Hello everybody, my name is Hazel Moyer and I work at the Centre for European Studies at the Australian National University, and this is my first effort at something that we're calling a webinar, but is probably more accurately a videoed seminar. I'm going to cover the basics of GIs in this presentation. It's very introductory. It's designed for those who want to catch up very quickly with what a GI is and how to deal with it in an academic setting or a policy setting. So, the issues I'm going to cover are the origin of GIs, starting with the Uruguay round trade negotiations and the TRIPS agreement, and a little bit about post-TRIPS bilateral negotiations on wines and spirits, and then I'm going to look very closely at European Union GI regulations, because it is the European Union that drives a very active agenda for extending GIs through its trade treaties, that is, strong form GIs for foods. You'll understand more about that in a moment. Starting with the Uruguay round. Now, this was the round that gave us the World Trade Organization. And while it started out as a normal multilateral round on the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which covers merchandise trade, agriculture was a big issue. Australia was involved in setting up the Cairns Fair Trade Group, and agriculture was included for the first time. So too were services. So really it went a great deal beyond trade, and quite unfortunately, while everyone's attention was on these many, many treaties, some of the powerful lobby groups were able to slip in the trade-related intellectual property agreement, which actually, because it's intellectual property, it covers monopolies and restraints on trade and sits very uneasily in a free trade environment. At the end of that round, the Marrakesh Agreement required countries to sign up for the whole set of treaties, or they could no longer be in GATT. And that's how the nations of the world acquired the TRIPS Treaty. And TRIPS gave us GIs. So it gave us a lot of other things, but that's a matter for another occasion. So, geographical indications, what are they? Well before TRIPS, there was the late 1800s Paris Convention, which basically covered patents, designs, and trademarks. But it also had an article that said a trademark should not cause consumer confusion or constitute unfair competition, and that's relevant to the GI issue. Then there's the 1958 Lisbon Agreement that hardly anybody belongs to, and it's about appellations of origin. And when TRIPS came along in the mid-1990s, it actually led to a new definition. Geographical indications was not a term that was previously used, and the definition is introduced in the TRIPS Treaty. And the most important thing to remember about GI policy is that it is simply about how you label your food products. Who may use that label and who may not use that label. And that's all it is. Under TRIPS, there was a major dispute between the EU and the USA about the inclusion of geographical indications. The EU wanted to make sure that it recovered European place names for the exclusive use of European producers, whereas New World countries and agricultural exporting countries, who had been countries that had received European migrants over 100 years or more, said no, these people brought with them their production, their tradition, their culture. They've set it up in our country. They've established large markets in our country through their own productive effort, and they should be allowed to continue using those names. So TRIPS ended up with 3 different articles. TRIPS Article 22, which defines a GI as a product which has a characteristic essentially attributable to the region, simply requires countries to implement Paris Convention Article 10 bis, so that you can't use a place name for misleading uses or uses that constitute unfair competition. And you need to have processes to refuse or invalidate trademarks if they do mislead consumers. But basically that boils down to don't allow place names for ordinary trademarks. Of course, in a country that uses a trademark system to register a GI, then there's a special type of GI called, in Australia, a certification mark that is used for a place, and a place is allowed then, but not for a normal trademark. Now, the very disputed territory is TRIPS Article 23, with its stronger rules for wines and spirits, but it only applies to the future. So that Article 24 provides exemptions for all the current users, but the EU approached the New World countries and said, can we do a deal? So post-TRIPS, the EU has negotiated more than 20 bilateral wine agreements. And in those wine agreements, the EU offered improved access to the European wine market in exchange for the wine producers moving away from the use of geographic names and replacing it with the use of wine varieties. So now if I want to buy Burgundy in Australia, I ask for Pinot Noir. And that's all sorted. It was a trade. Everybody was happy to do that because for the one-off cost of re-educating their consumers, they were able to sell more wine into Europe. It was a win-win situation for everybody. The issue now is that the EU wants to extend that form of GI to foods, and there's not anything obvious that they can offer to trade in exchange for that. So that takes me to the last of the TRIPS Article 24, which is really a grab bag with about 9 other provisions, including continuing negotiations, TRIPS Council oversight, so on, but the most important thing is that existing users of wine and spirit names can continue to use those names. And that if a name is generic, then it can't be registered as a GI. Of course, an ongoing dispute is, well, when is a name generic? And where is a name generic? So, in the post-TRIPS situation, just summing up, the essence of a GI is a label of geographic source. And it is only for goods where there is a characteristic that is essentially attributable to that geographic region. Anybody has the right to use the registered GI name, but only if they come from the designated region and they follow the designated process. So it's kind of like a trademark, and in fact it's kind of trademark in origin, but it doesn't tell you who you bought your product from, it tells you where you bought your product from. And it's not individually owned, it's owned by a community group, it's owned communally, and as a consequence, you can't sell it and you can't license it. And then another thing that is a little bit different about GIs than trademarks is how they're enforced. Because within the trademark system, it's really very much about the individual owner taking legal action if the trademark is misused by somebody else. With GIs, particularly the European GI approach, it's very much about the government bearing the cost of enforcing. So the enforcement cost shifts from the owner of the name to the taxpayer. Moving on then to EU GI policy. Well, every form of intellectual property creates a privilege to the owner of that property. And in theory, there is always meant to be an offset benefit that goes to the public, because the privilege almost always involves either a monopoly or a restraint on trade. In trademarks, the privilege is that the producer does not need to demonstrate that the trademark being used by another producer has created consumer confusion. That is defined as existing in the nature of trademark legislation law. So they only have to prove that the misuse of the trademark by somebody else has caused them an economic loss. That's the benefit to the trademark owner. The consumer benefit is that they have reliable information on who the producer is. Though there are, with the multiplication of brands, there's some qualifiers on that, and in the notes that go with this video, I've suggested some reading on that, because there's some good material there. Now, in the EU, the registration of a GI confers several different benefits. It confers the benefit of administrative enforcement, so that the owner of the GI does not bear the costs of enforcing it. It means that nobody else can sell that product in the EU with a qualifier. So you cannot sell into the EU Parma ham made in Canada. Parma style ham made in Canada. And you cannot evoke the registered name in any way. This is very controversial, the evocation. It means that, well, for example, more than 100 years ago, Perrier used to sell its water into Germany as the champagne of mineral waters. And they're not allowed to do that anymore because it brings champagne into disrepute, allegedly. So this kind of evocation, it prevents cross-marketing. And it's a really big issue in the disagreement between the EU and the US, because under US commercial law, there are freedoms of speech that allow you to do comparative advertising. And the other thing that GI registration in the EU gives you is it gives the consortium who owns the name access to EU funds for marketing their product. Now, there are three kinds of GIs under the EU. This one, traditional specialty guaranteed, is a really small category. It's hardly used at all. I'm really only including it here for completion. It simply protects the recipe. So anyone who follows the protected recipe can sell the product in the EU under that name. But people don't use it, and there's really only two products, mozzarella and jamon serrano, however you pronounce that, which are well-known products that have TSGs. And not many member states have used it. The main part of the game is in protected designations of origin and protected geographical indications. Now, the initial draft legislation in 1992 was only about PDOs. It was drafted by the French, and the PDO is the one that most non-Europeans are most familiar with. It comes from the wine industry, actually comes from preventing fraud in the wine industry. It's kind of like the Appellation Contrôlée designation, right? That the product must be produced in that region, otherwise it cannot use that name. So a very strong link between the product and the place it comes from. But the Germans said, hey, no, hang on a minute, we've got a different form of GI. We've got a form of GI that's created by our courts through a series of cases about protecting the reputation of a producer. So the PGI, the Protected Geographical Indication, is very much about a producer's reputation linked to a region. And to register, you've got to demonstrate a 25-year history, but you do not have to produce your product in that place. There are no rules that I have found in the EU system that require any minimum amount of activity, so that when you call your product Lübeck marzipan, it may be made somewhere else, but there's a tradition associating it with Lübeck. We've been trying to do some work about the impact of GIs, and for that we need to have data. The EU keeps separate databases for each of its types of GIs, that is, wines, spirits, aromatized wines, and agricultural products. But actually the only one that's a genuine database is the one for foods. The others are not interactive databases, they're simply PDFs, but you can get some statistics for the wines and spirits one, and the aromatized wines is 5 products on a single page. But the DOOR database does produce information, but not very useful information for an economist, because all it gives you, effectively, is a list of the registered names. Now, for each of those registered names, it will tell you the country, it will tell you the product class, it will tell you maybe the date the registration was submitted, but not for the early ones. It'll tell you the date it was approved. It won't tell you how many people are using it. It won't tell you the value of the production. It won't even tell you the place. To get the place, you have to cross-match that data with a geo database in order to locate your GIs in a specific place, because our colleague Filippo Alfini from Parma has done that to do some econometrics on GI foods in Italy. But what these data show you are the extent to which a small number of countries dominate the GI system in Europe. There was a pre-existing systems in 5 member states, Italy, France, Spain, Portugal and Greece. These are the bottom 5 states in that most left-hand block in each of these blocks. And this simply shows you the initial registrations for PDOs on the left, PGIs on the right, and then the current data as of the 2nd of December 2018 in terms of the numbers of registrations. So although other member states have started to use the system, you can see very clearly from this in terms of the number of registrations, this is a system that benefits a small number of member states and isn't a lot used in the others. Now, having looked at the available evidence on PDOs, including the evidence from case studies, there are some issues that would be of concern to any country wanting to look at an EU-style GI policy and say, shall we adopt this? For example, for the very early registrations, products registered before 1984, that is, before the GI regulation even came in the EU, so it's only the 5 member states that had their own systems who can benefit from that. For certain products, the raw materials do not have to come from the region. So your Parma ham pig does not grow up in Parma. They can grow up as far as 600 kilometres away. Now, they can't travel all the way from there to Parma to be killed. That's against EU regulations, because it's cruel to move an animal more than 200 kilometres in order to kill it. So I'm not quite sure where the abattoirs are located. But then there's a really big issue about climate change. I mean, there are issues already, and there are examples of current registered PDOs where the source materials have changed over time and kept changing, even though they're meant to be kind of long-term historical, cultural, fixed in time and place. But we all know climate change is coming, and there's certainly at least one author who thinks that the Champagne region will need to grow their grapes in the south of England in the future, which would have been easier before Brexit, but there we are. And then there are claims to very long supply chains. So again, going back to Parma ham, although the pigs come from a long way away, you may not buy a leg of ham and take it to your country and slice it and package it and call it Parma ham. It ceases to be Parma ham if it's not sliced and packaged in Parma. So quite how you label it, I'm not sure, but presumably it does undermine the market for buying legs of Parma ham. That's the problem with the PDOs, which are meant to have this really tight relationship between the quality of the product and the place. And yet we see that there are exceptions, and perhaps there are excessive protections in terms of the length of the supply chain. When we turn to the German style protected geographic origin, as I mentioned, there's no minimum requirement for how much comes from that area. Indeed, there was a case that the German High Court referred to the European Court of Justice saying, we're concerned about this. There doesn't seem to be enough activity happening in the place whose name is on the label. The ECJ did not look at that issue. As you know, I mean, courts decide what they will and won't look at, and it's not necessarily the matter referred to them. They had a look at it, they said all the formalities are right, no problem, which suggests to me that perhaps the member states in the EU would have the freedom to add to the GI registration process when it goes through their country system before it goes to Brussels, a requirement about how much of the activity should occur in a geographic area. And there are examples where some materials come from very far away. When we ran our workshop in Berlin in September, and that's available on our homepage, Andrea Zappalaglio made a very interesting presentation on PGIs, and one of the examples he gave was this Italian meat product where the raw material is from Brazil. But there is nothing, if you go to the consortium webpage, that tells you that. And when I was talking to the Scottish Food and Drink Federation, when I was in the UK, they told me the story about Scotch beef. I mean, they managed to get Scotch beef registered because they did it very early, and they wouldn't now because it's like a country name, not a place name. But initially, the cows only had to live in Scotland for 90 days out of a 1.5-year period, and they could be killed and sold as Scotch beef. And the TV's got hold of that. And the TV ran this scandal story, oh, your Scotch beef is not Scotch beef, and they changed the regulation. And now your Scotch beef is born, bred, lives all its life and is slaughtered in Scotland. So this very tenuous link for the PGI system, which is now as many, if not more than, the PDOs, actually calls into question the integrity of the whole system and is something that needs to be looked at. Now, over time, the EU has changed its policy. The first regulation came in 1992, and we've discussed that, and it was dominated by the 5 Mediterranean member states. Then there was a WTO dispute in the year 2000 that led to changes in the year 2006. And the dispute was brought by both Australia and the US, and they claimed two things. One, that the regulation did not allow non-EU producers to register their GIs. And the WTO found that, yes, the regulation discriminated wrongly and it ought to be changed. But they also said there's not enough protection for pre-existing trademarks. And the court said, no, the system is fine. So the EU won part, the US won part, and it created an opportunity for changing the regulation. And the most significant change to the GI regulations was the 206 one. There was another one in 2012, but it was minor in comparison. Now, the 2006 one made a large number of changes besides dealing with the EU, with WTO dispute problem. And the changes that are problematic from a policy view are highlighted in blue. So the fact that it allowed non-geographic names to be eligible for PGI registration. Now, this is the other side of the coin to don't give a trademark for a geographic place, but please don't give a geographic indication registration to a word that isn't a place. So feta, for example, there isn't a feta. Well, there might be somewhere, but it isn't in Greece. Feta is a word that means slice in both Italian and Greek. Now, fontina is an Italian word meaning fountain. So which fountain does fontina cheese come from, right? It is hard for people to avoid using a place name in the wrong way if it's not a place name. Now, the exceptions to raw materials registered before 1984 we've talked about. The other thing that was in the original regulation that's quite interesting is the Commission was required to develop a register of generic names, and it tried, and it failed. And I'm not quite sure how many member states there were at that time, but in the year 2000 there were only 15, so it was a number that was 15 or less, and they couldn't get agreement on any one name. But the name that was proposed most often for the generic register was feta. But given that that was impossible, they quietly dropped that requirement, and then they did a few other things that were quite good, like setting up a public register. The 2012 changes followed an appallingly poor quality evaluation, and that's not my judgment, that's the judgment of the European Commission Impact Assessment Board, which sent it back to be redone and still wasn't very happy with it. And the most interesting thing about the paperwork on that is that it points out the failure of the GI scheme to attract very small-scale producers. And yet, when people are promoting GIs, they very often mention the benefits for very small-scale producers. So there was some streamlining and shortening in administration to try and deal with that. I haven't yet seen the results of any evaluation as to whether it solved that problem, and I'm waiting with interest to do that. Now, I'm going to finish up by turning very quickly to 3 broader ways of looking at EU food GIs. One is the rationales, Well, there's an intellectual property rationale, which is not a problem for Article 22, because it's that long-standing thing that if you want a name for a trademark, it shouldn't be a name that should be available to other producers. That's fine. The TRIPS Plus article that's saying feta-style cheese from Gippsland is misleading to consumers, I find difficult to understand. Certainly Australian consumers can read, and they can read that, and they know what they're getting. And if they want feta cheese from Greece, there are plenty of feta cheese from Greece products on the market. We also have Danish feta. It's been on the market for ages. And Denmark is still allowed to sell their feta in Australia as Danish feta, but they can't sell it in Denmark as feta anymore. They have to call it salad cheese. And the evocation issue is really a TRIPS Plus standard. And I find it hard to see just what is the consumer benefit from preventing that. So to me, the IP rationales aren't very interesting because they don't appear to be very sound. They do make a great deal of information asymmetry, which is actually an economic argument about buying cars and fridges. And it isn't very applicable to something you might purchase every week, like some cheese. But there are reasonable potential rationales in the area of agriculture and regional development. Do GIs work to raise producer net income? Do GIs work to increase regional prosperity? These are critical issues that we've been investigating over the last year, and the next seminar looks at our results of our findings there. And we didn't deal with the cultural one, but that is also important about protecting traditional methods. But that's where the TSG, the little used version, is useful. Now, the economics. Net producer income. Well, the first question you have to say is, how big is the market? Right? I mean, there's all agricultural product, and then there's the GI market, and there's the organic market, and there's the food miles market, and the fair trade market. And some consumers with discretionary income and an interest in these things will pay a premium to buy these more particular products. So the question is how many of them will pay how much premium? Because if there's no premium, then there's no benefit to the producer. But if there is a premium, then there's a possibility that the producer might get an increase in net income. Only if the premium is big enough to offset any higher costs of producing this higher quality product with all its registration protocols. So the first question is, what is the size of the market? How many people are willing to pay what kind of premium? And actually, when you pull all of that together, there's a lot of studies on that issue of a premium, but their results are quite contradictory and variable. Fundamentally, when you put all those studies together, the most frequent finding is that people are willing to support local producers. Doesn't matter that it's GI, not GI, but local draws loyalty. Right? Now, going from the ability to pay a premium and the size of a market to the question of the impact on net producer income is very challenging methodologically. And unsurprisingly, there are very few studies that deal with it. And again, their results are contradictory. And a critical question is, if there is a net increase in income, who gets it? Is it the initial producer? Or if it's a product that moves down a supply chain before it's consumed, does somebody else in the supply chain capture it? Then the other important issue in the economics of GIs is the contribution to regional economic growth. And again, we find very little empirical evidence and very little systematic findings, except that the main finding is something that we kind of knew before, which is that regional development is difficult. We all know that. There isn't a government in the world that is not interested in regional development. And effective regional development really requires a whole bunch of factors to work right together to create a kind of virtuous cycle of demand and growth and prosperity. And GIs have a place in that, quite likely, especially wine GIs, I would think. But GIs per se, there's no evidence that they will do the trick if the other things aren't working. Finally, the whole interest in GIs starts with the trade issue, because the EU wants GIs for food in its trade policies. And as I said at the beginning, that's not a problem for wines and spirits. That's sorted. The major disagreement is about names for foodstuffs. It's a disagreement between the European Union on the one hand and the US as the biggest player on the other hand. And countries like Australia, Canada, Korea, we have to tread a line between pressures from these different places. So the EU wants us to agree to the strong form no qualifiers for GI foods. It would like us to do administrative enforcement, shifting costs to taxpayers, and it would allow wants GIs to be recognised if there's a pre-existing trademark. On the other hand, the US wants a focus on processes to challenge the registration of a name, processes to recognise when a name has become generic, and an owner-based enforcement system, a trademark-style system for registration. So there you are, GI Basics in a nutshell. We've got 2 other seminars that are also going up on our website. One that takes the next step in looking at GIs and their impact on farmers and regional prosperity and trade issues, and another one on the history of regional specialties in China that will be presented by my colleague Wenting. Thank you all very much.
I'm Irina from Canterbury University, and I would like to ask you one question. Why, if you could please explain a little bit more on why Denmark still can export Danish feta cheese outside of the European Union, and does that mean that if Denmark can do that, why then Australia can't export to any other country in the world, like for example to New Zealand, Australian prosciutto? So how is that, where that gap comes from, and how that's going to be covered?
Well,
Thank you.
That's a very good question. Thank you very much. And basically all IP systems are systems of privileges provided by the governments of countries. So they all take effect only in the country where it's legislated. So Denmark, as a member of the EU, is bound by the EU legislation on GIs. And there was a dispute about feta, and Denmark, France, Germany, and the UK lost, and they were required not to use the name feta anymore, and I believe there was a transition period. But the consequence is that because it operates in the EU under GI law, Denmark may not sell a product called feta in the EU. But that law doesn't apply in Australia. So Denmark is allowed to market the same product which it sells in Denmark as salad cheese in Australia as feta. And it's always labelled Danish. It's very popular here. It's always one of the options there at the deli counter, as well as coming in a pre-packaged product. Now, as to Australian prosciutto in New Zealand, that's a matter for the New Zealand government, and I don't know what the New Zealand GI system is at present, but if New Zealand has recognised and registered prosciutto as a name for one of the consortiums, say Prosciutto di Parma, because there's several different prosciuttos, if it's recognised and registered Prosciutto di Parma in New Zealand, then that would prevent any country in the world from selling Prosciutto di Parma in New Zealand except the consortium from Parma. Right? And then this is where the dispute becomes interesting and intense in Korea, because Korea has a trade deal with the US, it has a trade deal with the EU, it's an important market for cheese from Australia, it's an important market for cheese from the USA. So the issue is, does the Korean agreement with the EU get in the way of our cheese producers selling their product to Korea? On the face of it, I think not, because the main products that we sell into Korea in terms of the 4% of exports that we sell from our cheese industry are not registered GI names in Europe. Thank you. Yes, you can have one more question.
Could you please a little bit explain more on compound names? Like you compound names, GI
Yes.
compound names, like you mentioned mozzarella or prosciutto di Parma,
Yes.
or buffalo de
Yes,
So how that
Well,
matters with
that's another really good question, because if you actually look, there's more than 1,300 GI names registered for foods in the EU, and most of them are highly specific. So they'll have a type name together with a place name, and it's registered as a compound. It exists as a compound. In my view, it's highly unlikely that anyone else in the world would actually try and make a product with that exact combination of compound name and place name. So I don't actually believe that action is necessary to protect those names, suppose those products were to be exported. But when you look at what's in the EU trade treaties, you find that the number of names listed in the treaties is very much less than 1,300 and some, right? So it's only the key names that travel far. And most GI products do not travel very far. The vast majority of registered names are consumed very locally. And it's only a small number of names that have a global market. So when it comes to looking at the names that are listed in trade treaties, so the Canada one is interesting to look at for Australia, and there are 171 names listed there, but most of them are highly specific names. Some of them are broader names, and that might cause problems, but surprisingly, some of the broader names are not registered. So Brie, for example, is a name that's in the public domain, right? But Brie de Mieux is not. So the compound name is actually a protection to me, both for the producer and the consumer. It's quite specific in identifying the region and creating the kind of loyalty, but it's not so generic that it gets in the way of other people saying, oh, the way they make that kind of cheese, Brie-style cheese, that's rather good. We want to have a go at doing something like that. So there's dozens of different Bries in Australia. There's triple cream Brie and double cream Brie and however healthy you want to be Brie. But they're all, they're allowed to use the name because it's for free. It's a public domain. And then there's the issue of translations, right? So there's issues like if Parmesan is protected, which it's not, but Parmigiano di Reggiano is. But if Parmesan's protected, would Parmigiano be protected? What about the translations of the names? And by and large, the translations don't get the protection.
Thank you. I'm Wenting Chen. I'm currently visiting at the NU Center for the European Studies, and I have a question for what happened if there is one place but there are different types of products using the same name?
That is another really, really good question. It goes to the heart of whether GIs are effective policy for regional development. And let me give the example of Tasmania. Well, you could probably even use the whole of New Zealand because they're very good agricultural marketers too. But Tasmania produces a range of very high quality regional products that have been very successfully marketed overseas into demanding markets, particularly in Northeast Asia. And they sell a range of products. So Tasmania is known in countries like Japan for the quality of its cherries, and its abalone, and its cheese, and its salmon, and the list goes on. But a GI registration name is for one product, but it's not even for cheese. With a trademark, you can take out a trademark and it covers a whole class of goods. So if you take out a trademark, you can produce any good in that class and use that trademark. Not so for a GI. For a GI, the product specification is written down. So the GI name relates only to that one highly specific product produced with that product specification. And if you're trying to promote a region, then you've got a problem because you're going to have dozens and dozens and dozens of names. One for the cherries, one for the abalone, one for the smoked salmon, one for this cheese, one for that cheese, one for the other cheese. It's going to look very messy. So when I look at a case like Tasmania, which is so successful in marketing overseas, and it's got this brand Tasmania that sits over the top of all these different producers who likely have their own trademarks, and I say, do we really want to have all these name labels coming in underneath? Is it going to help? And I can't see the evidence for it helping, right? On the other hand, if you take a region like the Granite Belt, which is about 2 to 3 hours outside of Brisbane, so ideal for weekending, there's a new GI registration of Granite Belt wines. Now note that that's a wine registration. So wines are different. Wines do carry a high premium, and people will travel for wines in a way that they will not travel for cheese. So the Granite Belt GI name for wines gives the Granite Belt region the opportunity to build a whole regional development strategy around that, but likely without other GI names. So together with people coming for the vineyards and the wineries, there'll be accommodation, there'll be restaurants, there'll be food producers, there'll be people who make local produce and sell it to people because they like to go shopping when they've got on the weekend. And all of that will happen. So I think a wine GI can be very useful in creating a base for regional development. But when it comes to food GIs, I don't see how it works without getting so messy that it's confusing to the consumer. So thank you. And if anyone else has any other questions or comments at any time, this is my email address. Please write to me. We're always willing to seek improved viewpoints, new knowledge, whatever comment you have, do send it to us. Thank you very much.